The room breathed like a held confession as Ethan Cole knelt on splintered boards and cupped his hands around a wavering candle. The air tasted metallic, and the walls seemed to lean in. Ethan said, "If anyone hears me, I cannot carry this alone." The flame stretched thin, a silver thread pulled by an unseen hand. Shadows drifted the wrong way, as if time had turned and forgot to tell the light. The floor shivered with a low hum that rattled his ribs. Ethan said, "I am tired of my own voice." The candle burst into a cold white blaze that did not warm his skin. Light flooded the corners and erased the stains, and yet his guilt stayed heavy. A tall silhouette gathered inside the glare, its edges molten and precise. No wind moved the curtain, and no footstep broke the hush. The light pressed on him like a hand. A voice arrived inside his chest rather than his ear. The voice said, "You have been seen." The words scalded and soothed at once, leaving a mark he could not touch. Ethan bowed his head as ash lifted into the pale storm of light. Morning crawled into the attic like a rumor that refused to leave, and Ethan stared at the chilled wax as if it might speak again. He could not tell if the voice had saved him or marked him. Ethan said, "Seen by what? And to what end?" Downstairs, pipes ticked like old bones, and the house smelled of rain and metal. The quiet felt staged, as if a cue had been missed. Ethan folded the scorched plate into a newspaper and slipped it into a backpack. He wanted to run and could not choose a direction. Ethan said, "I will not lose my mind today." He walked to the street, and the city felt newly drawn, every edge too clean. Storefront glass threw back his face like a witness. The message rested in him, heavy and bright. Ethan said, "If I was seen, then I must answer." A bell rang at the end of the block, and he followed the sound as if it had the shape of a path. His steps steadied, and the fear stayed, but it learned to walk beside him. The bell led to a modest brick chapel where Miriam Hale waited, as if she had already heard the day's confession. Miriam said, "You look like someone who carried a storm indoors." Ethan held back the stranger truth and offered smaller coins. Ethan said, "I have questions I cannot frame." Miriam guided him to a pew where the wood kept the shape of years. Miriam said, "Questions only need breath before they find words." The ceiling fan turned like a measured prayer. Ethan lifted the backpack and set it between them like a difficult child. He did not open it. Miriam said, "You can borrow my courage until yours returns." The window cast a strip of pale gold across the aisle, and dust rose to meet it. Ethan said, "I do not know if what I heard was mercy." Miriam's eyes steadied. Miriam said, "Being seen is not the end, but it is a beginning." Ethan nodded and exhaled, as if air had been owed to him. News of Ethan's unease traveled faster than his caution, and Jordan Blake arrived with a skeptic smile he wore like armor. Jordan said, "You look like someone who swallowed a flashlight." Ethan managed a tired grin that did not reach his eyes. Jordan said, "Voices in your chest sound like cardiology, not theology." Miriam did not flinch. Miriam said, "Sometimes truth borrows strange corridors." Jordan laughed softly and studied the backpack on the pew. Jordan said, "If your proof fits in there, open it." Ethan kept the zipper still because the proof did not feel tame. Silence held the aisle like a measured threat. Miriam said, "Not everything that matters survives a lab." Ethan felt the floor choose a side beneath his feet. Jordan said, "Then this is faith by rumor." Ethan said, "It is faith by bruise, and I am not sure which hand struck." The fan hummed an old hymn, and no one claimed the melody. As the day thinned, a quiet visitor stepped through memory rather than doors, and Ava Ramirez's voice rose from a pew behind them. Ava said, "I know what it costs to be seen." Ethan turned as if her words had pulled a thread in him. Ava's eyes carried storms that had already spent themselves. Ava said, "I once begged the dark to keep my secrets, and it took payment in years." Miriam inclined her head, as if pages turned in a book she knew. Jordan's smile faltered where facts could not stand alone. Ethan said, "If there is a bill, I need to read it. Ava nodded and touched the grain of the pew as if blessing it. Ava said, "The bill names pride first and comfort second, and sometimes it asks for company you plan to keep." The chapel felt larger, as if someone had opened a wall. Ethan said, "I will not buy my silence again." Far off, a door settled in its frame like a warning delivered late. The day after the chapel felt like a held note that would not resolve, and Ethan walked the river path with his thoughts stacked like unmailed letters. Ethan said, "If being seen is a beginning, then what is asked of me?" The water moved with a tired silver, carrying bottle caps and sky. Miriam matched his pace without crowding his silence. Miriam said, "Begin with the truth you hide from yourself." Jordan trailed a few steps back, pretending to study the barges. Jordan said, "Begin with evidence, not poetry." Ethan clenched the backpack strap, as if honesty might drag him under. Ethan said, "The voice was inside my chest and left a mark I cannot show." Miriam's gaze softened, but did not yield. Miriam said, "Not all marks bruise the skin." A gull hung over the current, like a question that refuses its own answer. Ethan said, "I am afraid that mercy will demand more than I can pay." Miriam kept the river on her left as if honoring a rule older than the path. Miriam said, "Mercy pays its own cost, but it invites you to surrender yours." Jordan sighed and kicked a stone just hard enough to make a point. Jordan said, "Surrender sounds like losing to me." Ethan breathed in the cold and let the fear stay visible. They stopped beneath a rusted truss where the city hummed like low thunder, and Ethan set the backpack on a bench as if placing a fragile truth on trial. Ethan said, "I carried this away because I could not leave it behind." Miriam waited without blinking, making space where excuses would not fit. Miriam said, "Open what burdens you and name what you find." Jordan folded his arms like a courthouse door. Jordan said, "If a candle exploded, we will see residue, not revelation." Ethan unwrapped the scorched plate, and the soot ring glittered with a fine silver he could not explain. Ethan said, "The light was cold, and it warmed me anyway." Jordan leaned closer and found his reflection caught in the burnt sheen. Jordan said, "Physics will have its quiet reasons." Miriam traced the edge without touching it. Miriam said, "I have seen hearts carry brighter residue than this." The river wind lifted the paper and made the ash whisper. Ethan said, "The voice said I have been seen, and I fear it saw everything." Miriam inclined her head like a prayer learning a new shape. Miriam said, "Then let everything be the altar where you stop pretending." Ethan felt the bench steady under the weight he finally named. Ava arrived with the measured quiet of someone who learned to walk through sirens, and she stood at the end of the bench as if summoned by the wind. Ava said, "You do not owe the darkness any more secrets." Ethan lifted his eyes like a defendant who finally meets the judge he trusts. Ethan said, "I believed secrecy was safety, and it kept me small." Ava sat and held the edge of the paper as if steadying a raft. Ava said, "When I confessed, I lost my disguise and found my breath." Jordan flicked a look that tried to be gentle and failed. Jordan said, "Confession is not a methodology." Miriam smiled at the river, letting its patients answer what they would not. Miriam said, "It is a doorway, and some doors do not hinge on proof." Ethan felt the words knock inside his chest, where the voice had left its seal. Ethan said, "I stole trust to feed my pride and called it caution." Ava's gaze did not flinch. Ava said, "Then return what you stole with interest." The wind altered, as if a large shape had stepped aside. Ethan said, "Interest is courage, and I am short on cash." Miriam nodded in the manner of someone who accepts flawed currency. Miriam said, "Courage grows when it is spent." They walked from the river to the chapel as the sky thinned to pearl, and Ethan rehearsed confessions like lines he feared to land. Ethan said, "Miriam, what if truth collapses the small peace I built?" Miriam did not slow. Miriam said, "Peace built on hiding is a rental with mold." Jordan tried humor and found it dull. Jordan said, "Honesty ruins parties, and saves data. Ava slipped ahead and opened the chapel door with a reverence that did not beg. Ava said, "Some rooms cure you by refusing your disguise." The pews waited like faithful witnesses, and a fan traced its patient circle. Ethan stood in the aisle and felt the old tremor in his bones. Ethan said, "I will speak, and I will not edit for likability." Miriam's eyes warmed as a teacher, hearing a correct answer, whispered. Miriam said, "Bring your whole voice, and let mercy grade the test." Jordan lowered his arms because the posture had grown heavy. Jordan said, "If the ceiling does not fall, I will recalibrate." Ava rested a hand on the back of a pew, as if blessing a stage. Ava said, "Say it, and let the echo choose its work." Ethan began with the smallest truth, and found it connected to everything, and the room listened with a patience he had not given himself. Ethan said, "I hid my failures, and borrowed virtue from borrowed silence." The fan hummed like a steady witness. Ethan said, "I resented help because help revealed need, and I worshipped self-sufficiency." Miriam's face held both grief and a light he could almost hold. Miriam said, "Keep going until the shame runs out of road." Jordan's jaw eased, as if the math had stopped resisting. Jordan said, "I can accept a dataset called motive." Ava folded her hands like someone cradling a repaired wing. Ava said, "Name the debt and release the debtor." Ethan felt the voice's inscription warm inside his chest without pain. Ethan said, "I wronged those who trusted me with their patience, and I will ask forgiveness." The room did not applaud, and he was grateful. Miriam said, "Forgiveness answers before you finish the question." Jordan nodded once, brief and real. Jordan said, "I can follow evidence that walks." The silence after spoke kindly. The morning pressed heavy, but Ethan still stepped into the chapel's side room, where papers and dust competed for space. Ethan said, "If I walk further, I may not know myself." Miriam arranged the hymnals, as though order could coax courage. Miriam said, "You already know yourself. You are learning to meet him." Jordan leaned against the wall, chewing on silence. Jordan said, "Self-knowledge without proof is just a diary." Ava lowered her eyes and traced a scar in the wood with her fingertip. Ava said, "Proof is the breath that remains after truth is spoken." Ethan unzipped the backpack and showed the scorched plate. Ethan said, "This mark will never explain itself." Miriam held her posture firm. Miriam said, "Then let the unexplained teach you humility." Jordan shifted his weight, unable to dismiss what glimmered in soot. Jordan said, "I cannot footnote this." Ethan's voice cracked. Ethan said, "I fear the unseen more than the lie." The room held them like a container for fragile things. Later that day, Ethan and Miriam walked beneath bare trees where shadows stretched longer than their roots. Ethan said, "My chest still trembles when I recall the voice." Miriam paused, tapping her cane lightly, though she did not need it. Miriam said, "Trembling means you are awake." Birds startled and rose, as if agreeing. Jordan followed behind, muttering. Jordan said, "Awake or unstable, time will decide." Ava caught up, her breath calm. Ava said, "I once mistook fear for madness, until mercy proved otherwise." Ethan pressed a palm against bark and listened to the silence. Ethan said, "Every step forward feels stolen." Miriam rested her hand over his. Miriam said, "Forward cannot be stolen, it is given." The wind carried fragments of hymn tones from the chapel window. Ethan's shoulders lowered as though laying down a pack. That evening, the chapel glowed with candles as Elias appeared again, calm as if returning from a pause. Elias said, "You fear the unseen, yet you fear the truth more." Ethan steadied himself, anger and awe colliding. Ethan said, "What do you want of me?" Elias's eyes carried silver edges of light. Elias said, "Not want, but reveal." Miriam stood nearby, hands folded. Miriam said, "Listen until you stop bracing." Jordan shook his head, but could not look away. Jordan said, "If this is imagination, It is cruelly consistent. Ava's smile softened the weight. Ava said not cruelty, but calling. Ethan pressed his hand against his chest as if to quiet the mark. Ethan said, then let the calling name me. Elias's form flickered brighter, leaving dust to shimmer. Elias said, begin with the name you avoided. The words stuck in Ethan's throat, dragging years of silence. Ethan said, I forged the numbers, and Jordan bore suspicion. Jordan's lips tightened as memory rose. Jordan said, I knew but could not prove it. Miriam let silence hold weight without breaking. Miriam said, confession is soil where something grows. Ava leaned in, her eyes kind. Ava said, the ground is ready. Elias watched, the glow unwavering. Elias said, truth spoken is the first restitution. Ethan felt tears burn, not as shame but as cleansing. Ethan said, I feared my fall more than your burden. Jordan sighed, the knot loosening. Jordan said, now the burden leaves. The room did not collapse. It held. Lucian entered like smoke through a crack, his smile sharp as a blade. Lucian said, truth frees no one, it only chains you in daylight. Ethan clenched fists, but did not retreat. Ethan said, I will not rent my soul again. Jordan stepped closer, surprise in his steadiness. Jordan said, we are not buying your lies. Ava's voice rang soft but iron. Ava said, daylight heals what shadows distort. Miriam lifted her eyes unshaken. Miriam said, you arrive late to the feast you never prepared. Elias faced Lucian without shifting light. Elias said, leave him to his choice. Ethan inhaled, the mark on his chest no longer burning but glowing steady. Ethan said, I choose daylight. Lucian's grin faltered, smoke thinning as the candles flickered brighter. Morning mist draped the streets as Ethan walked with Miriam, each step heavier than the fog. Ethan said, confession freed me but exposed me too. Miriam's cane tapped rhythm. Miriam said, exposure is not ruin, it is clarity. Jordan followed reluctantly, phone in hand. Jordan said, clarity still needs proof. Ava carried coffee like a benediction. Ava said, proof is not stronger than mercy. Ethan exhaled and let himself stay visible in their company. At the river's bend, Lucian appeared leaning on the rail, the fog clinging to him like loyalty. Lucian said, you speak of mercy while debts mount. Ethan tightened his grip on the rail. Ethan said, debt confessed is debt paid. Lucian's grin spread thin. Lucian said, only fools call chains freedom. Ava stepped close, steady voice. Ava said chains fall when light insists. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Jordan said, I will not wear your doubts again. Miriam raised her chin. Miriam said, he is not yours. That evening, Ethan sat with Ava in the chapel pews while Miriam lit candles. Ethan said, what if truth strips me of everything? Ava smiled gently, no pity in her eyes. Ava said, then truth has made space for better things. Miriam's flame touched wick after wick. Miriam said, light multiplies when shared. Jordan entered late, but his silence was different, curious, not cynical. The night deepened, and Ethan dreamed of standing in water that rose to his chest, silver reflections swallowing his steps. Elias's voice rose above the flood. Elias said, your fear drowns faster than you. Ethan cried, I cannot keep afloat. Elias's hand reached like light in the current. Elias said, let go of the stones you carry. Ethan dropped the imagined weights of lies, and the water lowered. He woke sweating, but lighter. Ethan told Miriam of his dream as dawn returned. Ethan said, he told me to drop the stones. Miriam's eyes warmed. Miriam said, dreams can be truer than facts. Ava brought bread wrapped in cloth. Ava said, let go, and hunger will not starve you. Jordan muttered, but softer. Jordan said, dreams may carry data I do not measure. Ethan felt lighter, not empty. Night folded over the chapel like a velvet verdict, and Ethan waited in the aisle where the air kept an old promise. Ethan said, "If I keep speaking, the next truth may unmake me." Miriam stood near the pulpit, steady as a lighthouse in fog. Miriam said, "Let the wave spend itself, and you will still be here." Jordan checked his watch, then hid the gesture as if it accused him. Jordan said, "Data can surprise without being divine." Ava rested on the front pew with hands clasped as if catching warmth. Ava said, "Sometimes the surprise is that grace arrived first." The lights hummed. The room held its breath for a visitor. A pale brilliance gathered where the aisle met the door, and Ethan knew the shape before it defined itself. Ethan said, "You were there in the attic light." The figure stepped from illumination, as if stepping from a sentence. Elias said, "I was sent because your silence dragged the living." Miriam bowed her head, not in fear but in recognition. Miriam said, "Speak what belongs to this hour." Elias turned toward Ethan with a gaze that weighed and lifted. "I," Elias said, "your first debt is truth to the one you wronged." Ethan felt the floor accept him and refuse his hiding. Elias moved closer, and the light followed like a tide that obeyed his step. Elias said, "The name you fear is the name you must face." Ethan understood and wanted to flee his own admission. Ethan said, "I forged a report to protect my pride, and Jordan paid for the fallout." Jordan's mouth tightened with memory. He had tried to out-argue. Jordan said, "I knew the numbers smelled wrong, and I still broke under the rumor." Ava offered her quiet as a place to land. Ava said, "Shame lies about the price and steals the receipt." Miriam lifted her eyes as if to lock the roof to the sky. Miriam said, "Confession is a key that does not return you to chains." Elias looked at the scorched plate on the front pew and let the silence weigh it. Elias said, "You asked to be seen, and the answer arrived." Ethan tried to breathe against the ache that followed honesty. Ethan said, "I chose myself and named it duty." Jordan's laugh came thin and real. Jordan said, "I chose bitterness and named it reason." The room did not judge. It only held. The door sighed, and a figure leaned in the threshold, with a smile that never reached his eyes. Lucian said, "Truth is a luxury for those who can afford the fallout." The temperature dipped as if the night had entered their lungs. Ethan felt old dread wake and reach for his decisions. Ethan said, "You taught me to keep my image safe." Lucian's eyes glittered like polished doubt. Lucian said, "I only named the necessary cost of keeping power." Jordan bristled but stayed still because anger had failed him before. Jordan said, "Power without light eats its own." Ava's voice did not rise, yet it carried. Ava said, "You will not collect him on false interest." Miriam's expression did not change, but her stance narrowed the room's shadows. Miriam said, "Leave what you never owned." Elias did not move closer. Elias said, "He must choose, and choice is a door no one can open for him." Ethan heard the attic voice again, and this time it was invitation, not threat. Ethan stepped toward Lucian and felt the floorboards agree with the risk. Ethan said, "You offered me a kingdom of mirrors, and I starved in it." Lucian shrugged like a salesman between towns. Lucian said, "Reflection is safer than repentance." Elias's light thinned the dark into honest edges. Elias said, "Safety without truth is a locked room." Jordan let a small breath leave that had waited years. Jordan said, "I will hear the full accounting." Ava nodded, as if honoring a vow she carried for others. Ava said, "Let loss finish its sentence and turn the page." Miriam raised a hand not to stop, but to bless the next word. Miriam said, "Speak the cost, then lay it down." Ethan named each step of deceit like stones he returned to the river. Ethan said, "I altered the timeline, blamed the delay on your review, and let you carry the suspicion." Jordan looked at the floor, then back up. Jordan said, "I accept the truth and its repair." Elias turned his face toward the ceiling, as if hearing a distant bell. Elias said, The truth is spoken, and now comes the turn. The chapel seemed to grow windows where none had been. Ethan felt weight slide without vanishing. Ethan said, I will make restitution and speak where I once hid. Jordan's nod arrived like rain on dry ground. Jordan said, I will testify to the repair as loudly as the harm. Lucian flicked ash from a cigarette he had not lit. Lucian said, crowds forget, and guilt is patient. Ava's smile carried storms and sunshine. Ava said healing is patient too, and it keeps better records. Miriam wrapped the moment in words that fit as if tailored. Miriam said, let the vow meet the morning. The night did not end, but it tilted. Ethan said, I accept being seen, and I will not lease my soul to fear. Elias's light eased to a steady pearl. Elias said, then walk. Morning broke with a thin gold that made the city look forgiven, and Ethan met Jordan at a small office with blinds that cut the light into honest stripes. Ethan said, I will sign an addendum and publish the correction. Jordan held the folder like a bridge that might actually hold. Jordan said, we will submit it to every place the lie traveled. Ava set coffee on the desk with an ease earned by long storms. Ava said, courage drinks best when it is shared. Miriam stood by the window watching the street choose its pace. Miriam said, let truth do its work without hurry. The printer rattled. Paper smelled like fresh decisions. Ethan said, I feared this room for months, and now it refuses to fear me. Jordan allowed a small grin to move in. Jordan said, I will write the witness statement. The fear did not leave. It learned to stand without shouting. Ethan signed and felt the pen refuse drama. Ethan said, I will call the board next. The moment lifted its chin. The call began with formal greetings and the chill of institutional air, and Ethan chose plain words over polish. Ethan said, I falsified the timeline, and Jordan bore the blame I earned. On the speaker, voices shifted from surprise to silence. Ethan said, I have issued a correction and a public note. Jordan leaned in so his steadiness could be heard. Jordan said, I confirm the details and the repair. Ava stood in the doorway like a sentry for peace. Ava said, this will not devour you. Miriam lifted a hand, and though they could not see her, the gesture steadied the room. Miriam said, stand where your feet belong. The chair creaked. The air released an old knot. A board member spoke with careful measure. Board voice said, we accept the correction and will append the record. Ethan felt the sentence he had dreaded arrive and not destroy him. Ethan said, I will volunteer extra audit time until trust breathes again. They left the office and walked past glass that made the sky look near, and a familiar chill gripped the hall as Lucian stepped from an elevator with timing too perfect. Lucian said, institutions forgive to protect their brand, not your soul. Ethan considered the bait and declined to starve. Ethan said, I do not ask the brand to call me clean. Lucian's smile sharpened. Lucian said, then call yourself dirty forever. Jordan planted his feet like a study in balance. Jordan said, we let evidence breathe, and it chose repair. Ava's eyes shone without becoming glass. Ava said, you are late to collect what we no longer owe. Miriam shifted a fraction, and the hallway lost its echo. Miriam said, leave what seeks only to bind. The elevator chimed like a small verdict. Ethan said, I will not pay you with my future. Lucian looked bored with losing. Lucian said, we will see who funds your nights. Evening returned them to the river, where truth sounded like slow water finding stone, and Ethan carried a new quiet that did not fear itself. Ethan said, if there is more to lose, I accept the invoice. Miriam's smile reached the eyes that had watched many storms end. Miriam said, invoices shrink when paid in courage. Jordan loosened a knot in his tie as if removing an old badge. Jordan said, I can breathe in this math. Ava picked a flat stone and sent it skimming. Ava said, let the ripples do their gentle labor. The sky bruised into oranges that refused to spare. Ethan felt gratitude arrive without applause. Ethan said, "Thank you for outlasting my pose." Miriam nodded to the current. Miriam said, "The river honors what returns to it." Their silence learned to speak kindly, and did not demand more. Back at the chapel, the night deepened into a blue that made every candle braver, and Elias stood near the rail with light that did not bully. Elias said, "The test remains, but its teeth are smaller." Ethan approached, not as a defendant, but as one who learns. Ethan said, "I will not trade truth for smooth roads again." Jordan took a seat and let his weight belong to the wood. Jordan said, "I will remember that bitterness is lazy." Ava leaned forward with a softness that did not weaken. Ava said, "Take rest where it is offered." Miriam lifted a simple blessing, unnamed and sufficient. Miriam said, "Walk in daylight when it comes." The fan turned, and the air agreed. Ethan said, "If being seen costs me pride, I can afford the bill." Elias's smile belonged to quiet victories. Elias said, "Then the door ahead is already open." Dawn laid a silver seam on the attic window, and Ethan returned to the boards where the first blaze had found him. Ethan said, "I have come to close what I opened in fear." The candle waited, unlit, honest as a small tool. Miriam climbed the stairs with careful steps and a smile that did not force ease. Miriam said, "Some rooms change when you do." Jordan paused at the threshold and touched the frame as if greeting a former enemy. Jordan said, "I expected ghosts and found dust." Ava set a thermos on the floor like a promise of warmth. Ava said, "Let the light be ordinary and still holy." Elias did not appear as a spectacle. The air simply grew truthful. Elias said, "You are seen, and you are not undone." Ethan struck a match and did not flinch when it flared. Ethan said, "I receive the sight that frees." The flame settled, and no shadow rebelled. The room felt smaller and kinder, like a lesson that had learned mercy. They gathered at a small community hall, where apologies could be spoken without microphones, and Ethan faced a circle of faces he had once avoided. Ethan said, "I altered the record and let doubt stain a friend." The words did not sprint, they walked and reached who they were meant for. A volunteer smiled like a door that had no squeak. All voice said, "We receive the correction and the work that follows." Jordan added a brief truth that cost him less than resentment. "Oh." Jordan said, "I forgive you without a ledger." Ava's eyes shone with a relief that did not need applause. Ava said, "Let joy be quiet and complete." Miriam held a clipboard, and no agenda but care. Miriam said, "Repair will meet you where you stand." Ethan breathed in a freedom that felt like room for new furniture. Ethan said, "I will mentor the interns I once misled." The circle did not clap. It simply widened. Outside, clouds stacked like slow music, and Lucian appeared by the steps with a tired grin that mistook itself for wisdom. Lucian said, "You traded elegance for effort, and effort never stops charging." Ethan did not argue. He refused the courtroom that lived in his head. Ethan said, "I traded decay for labor, and labor builds a home." Jordan stepped beside him so the past would not circle back unchallenged. Jordan said, "We will not pay rent to old lies." Ava's laughter lifted, soft and disarming. Ava said, "You can join us or keep your empty receipts." Miriam's gaze held steady and kind, which proved stronger than scorn. Miriam said, "You may go in peace, even if you do not want it." Lucian looked toward the river as if hunting a mirror big enough to live in. Lucian said, "Peace is poor company." The wind moved through the trees like a patient choir, and no one replied. That evening, Ethan walked the river alone and felt the current carry more than trash and sky, and gratitude stitched itself to his breath. Ethan said, "I accept the cost and its mercy." Footsteps matched his, and Elias joined without ceremony. Elias said, "Redemption is not a bargain but a birth." The water answered with soft applause against stone. Ethan said, "I was afraid I would vanish if I lost my image." Elias looked at the western glow, as if reading from it. Elias said, "You lost a mask and found a face." A cyclist passed, and did not interrupt the sacrament of ordinary life. The city lit its windows, one by one. Ethan said, "I will keep choosing truth when it is slow." Elias's smile was the kind that belonged to steady builders. Elias said, "Slow is a faithful friend." The wind pressed gently, like a hand guiding without push. Back in the attic, the candle burned at a normal size, and no shadow dared to argue with it, and Ethan knelt not to beg but to thank. Ethan said, "I am seen, and I am not for sale." Downstairs, a kettle clicked off like a small amen. Miriam's laughter rose from the kitchen, mingled with Ava's storytelling and Jordan's dry punchline. Ethan said, "I release what I hoarded and keep what was given." The white fire of that first night did not return, yet its promise remained. Elias's voice did not echo in the room, and still it lingered where courage lived. Ethan said, "I will spend my days on repair and mercy." The floor did not shake, because it trusted him now. The flame leaned, then righted itself. Peace arrived without trumpets, and chose to stay.